Good morning. Trying something a little different here. I've got 8 hours sleep last night, so that may add a few IQ points and it may take away a few years. We'll see. What I thought I'd do is share with you something from the Mathew Franklin Whittier Library. You are now in the library. It's about, 8 feet by 4 feet or something like that. I won't be able to get through all of it. But and we won't be getting into the periodicals, I think, today. But what we're going to look at is the books. And these are things written by Mathew Franklin Whittier from, I'm not sure when the first one is, but his career was from 1825 to about 1875, or 50 years. Some of these things were claimed by and or published by other people. Some of them he ghost wrote, but some of them were just flat out stolen. And we're going to look at a whole bunch of things here. Now, I actually can't get to the very end, so we'll pull something from near the end. This I've shared with you recently. This is Lady Geraldine's Courtship. This is a later standalone version of this poem published by Elizabeth. I assume it was published by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. If she lived to 1870, which she may not have, then in which case it was published posthumously. But it's just that one poem. Published in a book form, rather lavish book. This is Matthew's slightly fancified account of his courtship with Abby when she was 15 and 16 and he was 19 and 20. It's not written by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. This is her volume of poems, which she published in England in 1844, in which that poem first appeared, called Poems. This is one volume. This volume doesn't happen to contain Lady Geraldine's Courtship, but it does contain some of the other poems that Mathew wrote. Wine of Cyprus, for example, which Mathew also wrote about his courtship with Abby when she would tutor him outdoors. Elizabeth Barrett Browning modified that to make it look like it was to her teacher, her own teacher. Here we have something interesting. Any idea what this is? This is the February 1845 edition of American Review. Oops, I got it upside down. In which The Raven was first published under the pseudonym Blank Quarrels. And there it is. I also have another copy of that in the first year of 1845. And it's also in here. Let's see. There's a review of that very book, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poems, including, I think, Lady Geraldine's Courtship is mentioned in here. So I have a review. I believe that Some Words with a Mummy is also in here. That's a story that Edgar Allan Poe stole from Mathew and very heavily reworked. That's on that page. But The Raven is also in here. So Mathew has a presence in here through Edgar Allan Poe, but nobody knows. I'm not going to attempt today to substantiate these things. I've substantiated them elsewhere, So that I won't be doing today. Now, what else is back here? This is a later reprint of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poems. This is the one that she published in America. Same poems, but she called it Drama of Exile and Other Poems. And Lady Geraldine's Courtship is in here. It's in the back. She explained in a private letter to her mentor, Hugh Stuart Boyd, how she happened to put this in the back. She told a whopper of a lie about this. And I should know better than to get too close to the camera. She told a whopper of a lie. She said that the 2 volumes she was getting ready to submit to her publisher were of uneven length. The first one wasn't long enough, and the publisher wanted to even them out by taking some from the second volume and sticking them into the first, and she didn't want that. So she had this poem she'd started just lying around, and she decided to finish it, which she did in kind of a dreamlike state in a single day. On a Saturday, if I remember correctly, meaning Lady Geraldine's Courtship. Well, I said I wasn't going to get into this, but this lie is so outrageously obvious. What the assumptions you start with allow you to accept all kinds of wild, stories, see, because you're locked into this assumption that she was the author. Nobody questions that, see. But she obviously wasn't. But I sat down and did a little test. I said, well, if I tried to copy this poem over in nice handwriting, took my time and tried to copy it over nicely, how long would it take to do 3 stanzas? And from that, I extrapolated that it would have taken her 5.5 or 6 hours just to copy this poem over, no less to compose it. See? So, and when she writes to Hugh Stuart Boyd, she makes a point to emphasize that when she says she wrote it, she meant compose. She says, by the way, I didn't mean to just mean write. I meant compose, see? And then she swears him to silence. She's a very obvious liar. You just have to know what to look for with these things. Anyway, by the way, with these glasses, this is getting to be my trademark of taking my glasses off and on. Praveen Mohan, who looks at the Indian temples, his trademark is his sunglasses. He's even got a fancy logo, a really cool logo with his sunglasses. Well, my trademark is taking these things off and on. The reason is they're dollar store glasses. I can't afford real bifocals. Now, back here is a book called The Man Who Called Himself Poe. In it is an anonymously published piece called The Atlantis, if I remember correctly. And in this book, there happen to be like the first 4 chapters of it. I can't find it because on the top of the page, they don't actually have it listed. I'm pretty sure that was Matthew's, but it was published in Baltimore, in a newspaper in Baltimore. Let me see now, with 8 hours sleep, if I can remember it. The American Museum of Science, Literature, and the Arts is the name of that, in 1838. I think that what must have happened is that this publication moved from Pennsylvania to Baltimore and was sold. It was sold in Pennsylvania, and the guy that bought it moved it to Baltimore. When he bought that, I think that he took with him pieces that had not been published but had been submitted to that paper. And so he got it down there in Baltimore and he looked at it and it was long, which is probably why it hadn't been published. And he said, I'm going to go ahead and publish this in a serial form, but I'm going to recast it in the South. So now the protagonist is from North Carolina or somewhere, see? And he probably changed the references to slavery a little bit to be pro-slavery or neutral instead of anti-slavery. Otherwise, it's Matthew's writing. I wish they had put on the top of this more than just the title of the book, because then I could read a little something from it. It's a science fiction story. Here we have. It's a science fiction story of a man who goes on an expedition to the South Pole, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken. And he meets, it turns out to actually be heaven. Basically, this is heaven accessed through the South Pole. Okay, and you can find stuff like this today on YouTube, contemporary science fiction. And he meets all these historical characters. And kind of like Some Words with a Mummy, Matthew was writing basically science fiction as a young man. And I've given you some other examples. And he goes to heaven, although it's a physical place, and he meets all these historical characters and he talks with them and he gets their take on how things are going now. Like I said, very much like Some Words with a Mummy. And the first person he meets is Benjamin Franklin, whom he claims to have been a friend of the family. He was sat on Franklin's knee or whatever. Well, Matthew very much admired his namesake, Benjamin Franklin. And so Matthew would have his character meet Benjamin Franklin first. Okay? So I'm pretty sure that was originally Matthew's. Let me read just a little bit. I think I've got it here. No, heck. All right, the heck with that. I'll do that another day if I do that. Let's see. I hate to just pile these things up, but I don't know what else to do with them. Maybe I'll put them back in a minute. What is this? Okay. This is Dr. Dodemus Duckworth, the life and adventures of Dr. Dodemus Duckworth. When Mathew had been editing for the New York Constellation under Asa Green for a couple years, in 1832, there was a terrible cholera epidemic in New York City. And Mathew stuck it out for a long time and was quite brave about it. But I think that Abby wrote him a letter and said, get out of there, So he did get out. And in 1833 and 1834, he wrote 5 little books. And they're all attributed by scholars to Asa Green. And the reason is that Asa Green is listed as the man who got the copyright registered, or in a couple occasions, I think the man who published them. I'm not going to go into all the details. I'm 100% sure that these are all Mathew Franklin Whittier's work and not Asa Green. For one thing, Mathew was the one editing the paper, not Asa Green. Asa Green was running his bookstore in New York City, as near as I can tell. So one of these is Dr. Dodemus Duckworth, and this is a satire. Some Words with a Mummy was a satire on quack medicine originally. I think the second trick ending, was added by Poe, but originally that was a satire of quack medicine, because the mummy says the one thing he really, really likes about modern society is the quack medicine. So that's Mathew's sense of humor. Dr. Dodemus Duckworth, the whole thing was a satire on quack medicine. And it's also the first that I know of Mathew doing these faux biographies, these fake biographies, which he became an expert at. He was expert even at this age. So this one is published. This is the second volume, 1833. So Mathew was like 21, 20 and 21. So that's Dr. Dodemus Duckworth. I have 2 volumes, volume 1 and volume 2. They're not mates. Then I've got another one of these books. This is called Travels in America. This is a satire on people from Europe who would come to America and write unfavorable accounts of it. See? So he has his character, George Fibbleton, Esquire, who was the barber to the king, come over here and have these adventures and write about America. See? But in the course of this book, 2 of Mathew's humorous characters show up, make cameo appearances. So Joe Strickland, which Mathew wrote when he was 13 years old in 1826, he initiated, as far as I know, that genre of writing in local Yankee dialect with Joe Strickland. Scholars have gotten that one wrong also, for reasons I won't go into. And then immediately afterwards shows up Enoch Timbertoes, which was also written by Mathew. Very similar. He's a backwoods character that comes to the big city, see? And then comes in his rival, Seba Smith's character, Major Jack Downing. So all 3 of these people in rapid succession make a cameo appearance in this book that Mathew wrote. And the third one, Major Jack Downing, goes on for several pages. So my feeling is that Mathew was thumbing his nose at Seba Smith and saying, I can write your character better than you can. I originated this genre and I can write him better than you can. Now, I think what I'm going to do is put these away and just, kind of edit out this part where I'm working. Otherwise, we'll have a huge stack, which I don't want. Have a stack this high on the table. All right, so what have we got next here? This is one of the 5 books that Mathew wrote, which are attributed officially to Asa Green, but this one is very significant. This is called The Debtor's Prison, A Tale of a Revolutionary Soldier. This is published, mine is published 35. This isn't the first edition. It was published, I believe, first in 1834. I'll hold it up to the camera. This is a social reform novel. Dickens wasn't writing anything like this in 1834. Okay, but this is a very well-written little social reform novel about debtor's prison, which I think had just been abolished in New York City, but they were trying to bring it back. So it's a beautiful little story. This is another one, but I could only afford a reprint of this because this goes for, somebody's got it for $1,500. And if you get on A Books, you'll find one for $5,500 and another one for $6,500. These are original old ratty copies like the other one. Well, here's the reason. The Perils of Pearl Street, including A Taste of the Dangers of Wall Street, this is the first written account of the financial market in New York City. Okay, so what happened, I think, is that two people who were stockbrokers and had lots of money decided they wanted a copy of this, and they bid it up, in an auction, to where somebody finally ended up paying $6,000 or $7,000 for it. Now the book collectors come in and say everything written by Asa Green is worth thousands of dollars, but they just sit there, for sale, and nobody ever buys them because it was only those two guys that would have paid that kind of money for them. See, so these books by Asa Green should be $50, $60, $100 or something like that, not like $6,000, but somebody artificially bid it up, and now the booksellers imagine they can get that kind of price for it. It's very funny. And the thing is, Asa Green ran a bookstore, but Mathew was pursuing a double career as a writer and in the mercantile world of trading. He was trying to be, this is where past life memory comes in. He was trying to be successful as a merchant so he could ask for Abby's hand in marriage, because her father was a marquis and he was very class conscious, and Mathew felt that he might give his permission if Mathew was a successful merchant instead of just a poor Quaker farm boy. So that's why Mathew was doing this, but he really wasn't cut out for it. And one of the things that's in here that's really interesting is about how when he first started out, they had him in pressure sales, and he couldn't do it. He was too honest to do pressure sales, and I'm exactly the same way. So I can definitely relate. Let's see, what else have we got? This is here, another reprint, which I can't find an original of, The Abolition Cause Eventually Triumphant by David Root. This is a sermon given by the pastor of the First Parish Church in Dover, New Hampshire. Well, Mathew and Abby eloped to Dover. I think they would have gone to this church because this fellow was an abolitionist, David Root. But they ghost wrote this sermon together for David Root. I'm not going to go into, that would take us too long to go into how I know. But this was actually written by Mathew and Abby together and delivered by David Root. Here we're jumping ahead. This is Lights, Keep Cool, Go Ahead, and a few other poems. This is published by George W. Light. He was the editor of a book called The Essayist, which we'll see in a little bit, in the early 1830s, about the time that Mathew was editing for the New York Constellation. He was also a friend of Albert Pike's, who stole Abby's poetry. Most of the poems in here were written either by Mathew or by Abby. Very early. He took them, reworked them, and published them under his own name. Here we have, for example, on this page, there's one on the left on page 22 called Sunrise Song, and on the right is something called Inward Life. Well, Sunrise Song was written by Abby, and Inward Life was written by Mathew. I think that Sunrise Song was when she first fell in love with Mathew. And I'll read a little. It's an ecstatic poem, and I think this is a young girl who has fallen in love with her older tutor. And she says, "Up, up, the morning breaks, firing all the hills. Up, up, the sunlight makes silver of all the rills. Birds are soaring, music pouring on the loving breeze. Flowers are blowing, rivulets flowing under the bending trees. Forth, forth, fanned by morning's purple wings, pluck the opening flowers. Join the song the springtime sings in its blushing hours. Dance, dance, while the chanting streamlet rings through the rustling bowers." This is Abby in an ecstatic mood, you see. She was a mystic, a nature mystic, and I've already read you the poem, the tribute poem that Mathew wrote for her after she passed on, called To a Bright Lady, that talks about exactly the same thing, her out in nature, singing, making music, dancing, see? Now, this poem at the end, it says, "Dance, dance, while the chanting streamlet rings." George W. Light was not out in nature dancing among the streams. It's manifestly impossible that George W. Light wrote this. This is obviously Abby Poynt. Now, Inward Life Now we have Matthew, the ponderous philosopher. He starts by quoting Milton. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Milton. Then he says, where is hell and where is heaven? Questions children sometimes ask. But to answer, hoary teachers have pronounced a fruitless task. When within us both are reigning, search beneath or soar above. Hell is but the blast of discord, heaven the regal sway of love. Can we see our heavenly Father? Yes, if we are pure within. Everywhere his blissful presence by the pure in heart is seen. So this is Matthew the philosopher writing in his accustomed meter, which basically matches the Raven and Lady Geraldine's Courtship. This is the mysticism that Abby has taught him, that you can find that all of these states, heaven and hell, are within, and that you can find God and see him in this very life within. That's the mystical creed. So none of those were written by George. There's a couple of George W. Light's poem, and they are light. Here we have Guide to the Whittier Birthplace, where Matthew grew up. I went to the Whittier birthplace once. Now, it's got a little picture of it there. Early on in the research, I never felt any sense of recognition from pictures of that farm where Matthew grew up. And this really confused me. Then I found pictures of it the way it really looked back in Matthew's day, which is to say unpainted and kind of, it looked like a 1600 farmhouse that hadn't been refurbished. The pictures that you generally see and the way it is now, it's been completely redone, rebuilt, no sagging lines, and white paint and everything trim and so on. Well, of course I didn't recognize that. What I learned from that is past life memory does not get triggered unless the thing really looks like it did before, and if there's emotion. But I went and visited that place, and when I got inside, it hit me like a ton of bricks. For better or worse, I talked to the Gus, I think his name is, the curator of that farmhouse, and he's a wonderful guy. I had a great conversation with him. Of course, he didn't know who I was. He didn't know that I claimed a past life as, a boy that grew up in that house. We just had a wonderful conversation. There's no point in telling him. I didn't tell him. He gave me the Whittier lore, which I was quite familiar with, and he picked up on that. And when he talked about Matthew, the only thing he had to say is that the boys were called by their middle names, which was not totally true, and that they called John Greenleaf Whittier Greenleaf, but then teasingly they called Matthew Peachleaf, and that was a joke, and that's all they said about him. So that gives you an idea of how he's been completely lost and marginalized in that legacy. But I knew that place, boy, and I really was not holding much in the way of expectations when I walked in there. I said, well, you know how it is when you build up something and then your mind builds up a prejudice, a block against it, and I walked in there and it was beyond anything I could have imagined one way or the other. What else we got? Here's Parkinsonian patchwork, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber. I just talked about that, so I won't go into that. And here's another one, The Life and Sayings of Mrs. Partington, which has Matthew's life of Mrs. Partington in the beginning. Same idea as the life of Dr. Dodemus Duckworth. He's just bringing that idea of a pretend biography back out again. Let's see what we have here. Got to get in my dollar store glasses. La Fontaine's Fables. This is volume 2. This is a tough one to prove. La Fontaine was a Frenchman. I forget when he lived. 1700s, 1600s. He wrote a version of Aesop's Fables in verse. Then a few people tried to translate them into English. They weren't very good. And then Elijah Wright, the editor of the Boston Chronotype, who was Matthew's good personal friend, at least when he published the Chronotype. I've showed you the Chronotype before. I'll show you another one. This is Elijah Wright's newspaper, the Chronotype, with the train on it. You get a better look at it without the light on it. Matthew had a very heavy presence in there, anonymously, and he wrote some scathing satire, very much like Lee Camp. But Elijah Wright in 1841 came out with La Fontaine's Fables, which he claims to have translated. And he has even a little story in the introduction about how he did it for his son, I think, and so forth. Now, he had only a college education. He must have taken French, but he was not a native speaker. What I've extrapolated from a whole bunch of clues is that when Abby taught Matthew, when she tutored him, French was one of the subjects because she was raised French. I know she was raised French. Her father was a Marquis. Her mother was Scottish. But her first cousin, Charles Poyen, when he wrote about progress of animal magnetism in America, and he writes about coming from Guadeloupe, which is where Abby's father was from, to America, he says he stayed at his uncle's house for 5 months, I think it was. That's Abby's home. So he stayed at Abby's home for 5 months. And then he says he left to go to Lowell to improve his English. That means French was spoken in that home. See, otherwise he'd be improving his English there. So he left to go to Lowell. Really, he went because Abby's father was impossible. It was autocratic, But he didn't say that. So he called him the old man. He was 54 or something. But we know that French was spoken in the home. So Abby was a native speaker. She gave him La Fontaine's Fables as his homework, I'm pretty sure. And he translated them. So what we have in the La Fontaine Fables translations is Matthew's skill at humorous poetry, which he was extremely good at humorous poetry, had written it for many years, and Abby as a child prodigy and a native speaker. Well, that's why they're so good. Elijah Wright never did any poetry before or since. This is his only literary claim to fame other than being the editor of the Boston Chronotype that I'm aware of. So what happened was that Matthew and Abby worked on this thing. And when Abby died in 1841, Matthew said, here, take these, manuscript, take this and make of it what you want, but keep our name out of it. He was in terrible grief. And Elijah Wright must have been his friend even then, in 1841. He said, take these. And, so Elijah Wright, not being too concerned about honesty, probably in the technical sense, made up this story about how he translated them, honoring Matthew's wishes. But it so happens that there's another version of this book published while Abby was still alive for children, a much smaller one, La Fontaine, A Present for the Young. It does not have Elijah Wright's name on it. It does have A. Wright, I'm not sure what his relation to Elijah Wright is, as the man who got the trademark. It says, entered according to the Act of Congress in the year 1839 by J.S. Wright. I don't know who that is. I don't think it's Elijah Wright. It could be if Elijah is a nickname, but I'm pretty sure not. I don't know if it's his brother. I don't know if it's any relation at all. But in 1839, Matthew and Abby were in Portland. And the note from the translator, it signed the translator, not Elijah Wright, makes it clear that this is literally, he uses the analogy, it's a trial balloon. He says, aeronauts, before risking their necks, often deem it prudent to send up a pygmy balloon to try the quality of the gas in the course of the wind. On the same principle, the fables which compose this little volume have been selected from a manuscript translation of the entire work of M. de La Fontaine. And it goes on, Boston, September 23, 1839. Well, people would sign from wherever they happened to be writing to, not necessarily where they lived. So if he was submitting this to the publisher in Boston, Matthew would have signed it in Boston. And when I go through these, what strikes me is that there'll be one of Matthew's favorites and one of Abby's favorites, and one of Matthew's favorites and one of Abby's favorites. They went back and forth. I'm going to just read the first one. The Grasshopper and the Ant. A grasshopper, having sung the summer long, when the wintry wind blew, found her comforts few. No house from the snow and sleet to guard her, not a single bit to eat in her larder. Neither worm chop nor fly leg. The dainty dame must starve or beg. Hungry she goes to her neighbor ant, with her sad tale of want. Pray, lend me from your store till the winter's o'er. On my faith I'll pay round interest beside the loan. The aunt, bad lender I must own, doubting much the payday, asks of the borrowing lady, what did you all last summer? Night and day to every comer I sang, if you please. Sang, do you say? Then finish out your play. Dance now at your ease. So that's, I don't know which of them would have liked that. I'm guessing probably Matthew. Now let's read the second one and see. The Raven and the Fox. It's very short. Perched on a lofty oak, Sir Raven held a lunch of cheese. Sir Fox, who smelt it in the breeze, thus to the holder spoke. Ha! How do you do, Sir Raven? Well, your coat, sir, is a brave one, so black and glossy on my word, sir, with voice to match. You were a bird, sir, well fit to be the phoenix of these days. Sir Raven, loath to lose such praise, must show how musical his croak. Down fell the luncheon from the oak, which grabbing up Sir Fox thus spoke. The flatterer, my good sir, I liveth on his listener, which lesson, if you please, is doubtless worth the cheese, quote unquote. A bit too late, Sir Raven swore the rogue should never cheat him more. So I'm guessing the first one was Abby's and the second one was Matthew's. Matthew was more concerned about not being fooled because he was gullible and he was fooled all the time. So anyway, it goes on like that. I think this was put out by Matthew and Abby as a collaborative effort, much as I tell you that A Christmas Carol was a collaborative effort. They wrote together. So Matthew and Abby wrote this together and published it together with the idea of writing a bigger one. But when Abby died of consumption, Matthew didn't have the heart to go through with it. And he just said to Elijah Wright, just take this, Let's see what else we have. Here's more of La Fontaine. That's the small version. This is how it originally looked when Elijah Wright published it. And it has lovely illustrations, which he says he took from the French, copied them over from the French. In here is very strong evidence that Matthew says that Edgar Allan Poe stole the Raven from him, but we won't go into that now. And what do we have over here? The Poets of Maine. And I think I've got it. In the Poets of Maine, there is a fellow named Charles Carroll Loring. Long story behind this, but Matthew, this is one of the young poets that Matthew must have mentored. And among the premier poem that they used to represent his work is actually something that Matthew wrote to Abby, for Abby. I believe it was not necessarily when she had died. I think she went for several months, possibly to Guadeloupe, to be treated in convalescence by Charles Poyen in Guadeloupe. That's I put that together. It's extrapolation, but I think that around the very end of 1839 or the beginning of 1840, I think. Yeah, Abby would have gone to try to get cured in a warmer climate. She came back in time to have their second child in July. But this is when she was away, and I'm telling you this is Matthew's poetry. It's called The Beating of the Rain. I lay the book aside and turn my weary eyes to the river's rolling tide and the overhanging skies. I try to pierce the gloom that swallows half the plain, and no sound invades the room but the beating of the rain. Yes, the river murmurs low like a spirit under pain in its ever onward flow to the rivers of the main. But for these a silent deep all the valley seems to fill. The flowers of the garden sleep, the singing birds are still. I hear no echoing feet, nor din of moving wain. No noise comes off the street but the beating of the rain. I love the soothing sound and monotonous refrain that comes from roof and ground at the beating of the rain. I often think of thee as the hours slowly wane. Dost thou listen now like me to the beating of the rain? Though from me thou art gone, thy pleasant looks remain. Still I hear thy tender tone in the beating of the rain. The day will shortly end, for the twilight shadows gain, Yet the river's murmurs blend with the beating of the rain, and the notes of yonder bell from the steeple of the fane, for vespers lapse and swell midst the beating of the rain. You'll notice a kind of trend in Matthew's poetry that's been claimed for Edgar Allan Poe. What can I say? I believe that's Matthew. I can't prove it. I don't even think that James Carroll Loring necessarily claimed that. I think it was in and amongst his papers, and somebody that put his papers together just assumed that that was his poem. Oh, I've got these things all stacked up. What the heck? Let's see. You can't get the one on the end. You have to grab something in the middle. There's the Crookshank's Comic Almanac, which has the Vulture and Mr. Spoon reworked as Winkinson, which I've already showed you. This is John Greenleaf Whittier's Snowbound. We don't need to go into that. This is The Essayist. And when I first saw this, I didn't really know what it was. I had some idea that, Matthew might be in it and Abby might be in it. And I thought this was $500. And I felt from Abby, buy it. And I'm like, that's a lot of money. And I felt from her, buy it. So I bought it. And I'm glad I did, because you can't find this anywhere. And it is very significant in Matthew and Abby's history. Abby's poetry, falsely claimed by Albert Pike, is in here. Matthew is in here in two ways. He's in here writing essays, including about Francis Quarles. Remember that the Raven was signed blank Quarles. He's writing as Franklin Jr. Now, one of the pieces in here is a dialogue between two kind of archetypal characters. It's signed Franklin Jr. And it is almost exactly like one of the F-signed pieces in the dial the month after Abby died. What it means is when Abby died, Matthew could not write for the dial at that point. And what he did was he went back, and one of the pieces that he'd written for the essayist as Franklin Jr., he just grabbed that one. It's like three pages, something like that. And he just signed it F, as he'd been doing. That's not Margaret Fuller. So when you look at that, it's pretty strong proof. But the other thing is that Matthew wrote book reviews for this publication, and he signed them with a star. I don't know if you can see this. I'm going to hold it up for a while, and you can screen capture this if you want to. He signed his reviews with a star, just as he did in 1844, 1846 for the New York Tribune, the ones that scholars think were written by Margaret Fuller. Okay. Matthew, this is like 1831. Matthew was doing book reviews with his star back in 1831. And he resumed using that signature in 1844 for the Tribune. So Margaret Fuller had no reason to claim that, in her personal history. Here's Albert Pike's Hymns to the Gods, which was published much later on. And he took the poems that Abby had written in his class in Newburyport, Massachusetts, when she was 14, and he reworked them and published them himself, claimed them all himself. Includes Hymns to the Gods and various other things. This is a minister named Prince. This is called Memoir and Writings of Prince. It was not written by him. I think it was written after he died. There's an essay in here, possibly several, which I think were originally written by Abby. I feel terribly jealous of this guy in terms of, I use my emotions as a kind of a barometer, to see which way to go with things. Well, I feel very jealous of this guy. I don't like him at all. He's very handsome, devilishly handsome. And his own letter to his father sounds very phony. It's exaggeratedly Christian, with lots of layers of religiosity on top. It doesn't sound anything like these essays at all. And these essays, especially one of them, the one that I picked up on, it's very esoteric. It's very advanced. very advanced stuff. It basically goes into what my guru Meher Baba would call sanskaras, or what are called samskaras if you read Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. This guy didn't have that kind of understanding at all. So I bought it for his image, and I reluctantly keep it in here. What I feel from Abby is she had no interest in this guy at all, but she actually just thought he was kind of vain. But she was being asked if he could use her essays as sermons, and she couldn't very well turn him down. It was, so she did, but she didn't have any interest in him. I was wasting my time and energy being jealous. I have to look to see what this is. Oh, this is A Christmas Carol. This is 1844, A Christmas Carol, the year after it was first published. It's been rebound back in the old days. There's some very new-looking replacement illustrations in it. I don't know who put them in or when. They're much better than, because I have another one here, which is a modern reproduction. But the replaced images in this refurbished 1844 edition are much better than the ones that are in this modern reprint. That apparently is basically what it looked like when it first came out. So that wasn't cheap, but see, as a collector, I don't really care that much about condition, so I can buy the cast-offs. Here we have, this is getting, I don't know that I can get through everything. The Tempter and the Tempted, A Story for Boys by M.F.W., published 1863. This is one of the very few works that Mathew published under his own name. It's a story for boys. You can't find this online. I think you can get it if you're in academia, but otherwise you can't find this online. I've got two versions of it. They're basically the same, except one version. The book itself is bigger, although the type area is the same. And there's a couple added illustrations. This is the smaller of the two. It's very well written, and the strange thing is it's written kind of like an adult novel. It reads like his adult novels, except he doesn't use really big words that boys won't be able to understand, and he kind of writes it from a boy's point of view, that a boy would appreciate. But it's about what Mathew went through, because Mathew was very easily fooled. He got in the wrong company. And that's what this is about. It's a boy that fell into the wrong company. And in particular, what pushed him over the edge is his mother died. So once his mother died, he started being susceptible to peer influence. So it's a book about peers. It's very heavily Christian, but Mathew was a Christian, so it's not insincere, but I think he geared it toward a Christian audience. And it's considered a Christian children's book now, so nobody pays the slightest attention to it. There's another copy of it. This is The Vagabonds and Other Poems by John Townsend Trowbridge. Magnificent, magnificent poet. This guy was a poetic genius. I mean, this stuff is as good or better than John Greenleaf Whittier's work. Probably, Mathew wrote different poetry, but I'd say it's better. Some of them in particular, and he was deeply mystical, so he was a mystic. I strongly recommend you read those poems. Here we have The Heir of Glenville. This is a novel that Mathew wrote quite early. This one was set in the American Revolution. Mathew apparently wrote a number of short novels, adventure novels, for Francis Durivage. And I have some examples here, which I'll show you. And they were republished later on. This is published in the late 1800s. So it's a reprint from the 1800s. They're all written by Mathew Franklin Whittier. None of these things are written by Durivage. Let's see if I can find a couple. We've got some in here where I have here's one. These are like dime novels. This is 5 cents. It's a nickel novel. From the Novelette Library, The Phantom of the Sea, or The Red Cross and the Crescent by Francis A. Durivage. That's Mathew Franklin Whittier's book. Okay, and there's others in here. Here we have The Mistake of a Lifetime, which I'll get to in a little bit, but this is one of the serialized chapters, or 2 or 3 chapters of The Mistake of a Lifetime. That's how it came out in serial form before it was published as a book. And there's some more. Here we have the Log Cabin series, Hunted Down or On the Trail for 40 Years by Francis A. Duravage. That was Mathew Franklin Whittier's. That's, I don't know how, 10 cents. Oh, that's 10 cents. So we have a dime novel there. This is Dewberry's Revenge, published in New York, 10 cents. Does it say when it was published? I don't see a date on it. Okay, all that's Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, claimed at one point or another by Francis Duravage. Whether he wrote some of these things, Mathew wrote, Ghost wrote for Duravage under that kind of agreement, and some of them Mathew stole. Here's another Heir of Glenville, another copy. Some of them Francis Duravage stole by tricking Mathew out of the rights to his portfolio, which I've discussed otherwise. Here is The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage. That's Francis Duravage. That's a compilation of stories that, with possibly 1 or 2 exceptions, were all written by Mathew Franklin Whittier. Here is another copy of that book. This is Mrs. Partington's Carpetbag of Fun. This was published after The Carpetbag folded in 1853. It was put together by somebody named Samuel P. Avery. I don't see what the date is, but it's after The Carpetbag folded. Avery apparently purchased the scraps from the Carpetbag, the unpublished scraps from the Carpetbag, and published them. There's quite a bit of Mathew's work. Now, I had mentioned that Mrs. Partington's nephew, Ike, which is the character created by Shillaber, was cruel to cats and hung the cat. There's a picture of him hanging the cat. Well, that's not the way that Shillaber meant about hanging a cat. He means he hung the cat. But here, the illustrator couldn't put it that way, so he had to have him in a bag. See? But that's not the way the text reads. See if I can find something that's Mathew's. This is about omnibuses, were drawn by horses. Those were Mathew's, I'm pretty sure. There's one in here about Mr. Slow that I'm 100% sure was Mathew. Fashionable novel. Well, from things I've shared recently that Mathew did a lot of satire about fashionable literature, so that's probably him. So there's a lot of Mathew that shows up in here. It would take me too long to find them, the ones that I'm sure about. There's maybe 10 or 15 that I'm pretty darn sure about. So that's another thing I've got a little copy of there. What else we got? When I absolutely can't find something online in the antiquarian original, sometimes I'll buy a printed copy. These are basically made from Google, some of them. Stray subjects arrested and bound over, being the fugitive offspring of the, quote, olden and, quote, young'un that have been lying around loose and are now, quote, tied up for fast keeping. Francis Duravage and George Pickering Burnham. Those were the 2 rogues who tricked Mathew out of his portfolio, and they have published a number of the pieces in there. This is gleanings from the portfolio of the, quote, young'un, and it's given here as George Pickering Burnham. This is George Burnham's own compilation of the portion of that stolen portfolio that went to him. Real crooks, these guys. This is Margaret Fuller Critic, which I've shown you recently. That's Mathew's work for the 1844-1845 New York Tribune. This is the Dial. I have the first 2 years, but you can't buy that in its original, so I have reprint of it. These reprints are at least photographed from the original, so it's authentic to that extent. These aren't cheap even. Everything in here signed with an F is Mathew's work, not Margaret Fuller. Margaret Fuller, when she put something in here as the editor, she didn't sign. The scholars think that she published under two different signatures, one anonymous with no signature, which is what the editor typically did, and one with F for Fuller. They're mistaken. The F is Matthew. I'm looking for an example. I'm not finding one right off. So I have two of those. Now, let's see. I think I'm going to stop for a minute, put these back on the shelf, at least to get them out of the way, and then I will come back. All right. I've made a little bit of space anyway. I'll have to go back through these. Let's see what we have here. This is a historical encyclopedia. Cyclopedia of History, 1835. I believe that this was ghost written, at least in part, that Matthew wrote this for Durivage, compiled it for Durivage, during the same period that he was writing the books that are attributed to Asa Green, like Perils of Pearl Street. So it may not all be Matthew, but a popular cyclopedia of history, ancient and modern, forming a copious historical dictionary, etc., etc., etc. What Matthew did was to take his curriculum that Abby had taught him and use it and use his notes to turn it into a cyclopedia of history, I think. There are, for example, one of Matthew's favorite words, sublunary, which also appears in the original edition of The Raven, is in here twice. And it's kind of a comic word, you know. It's just one of his favorite words. Normally, you wouldn't use it in a dictionary, but Matthew used it twice. And then you get into, for example, Robert Burns, and there's a long entry for Robert Burns. You can tell the things that Matthew particularly loved by how long the entry is, So, and by the writing of it. Robert Burns isn't particularly long, but you can tell by the way he writes that, somebody that was a poet and really loved Burns wrote it. Let's see. He married the early object of his affections, the, quote, Bonnie Jean, of whom he has written so tenderly in the most musical of his verses. She survived the poet who immortalized her name and died within the year 1834. Burns might have prospered and enjoyed a long life had he but listened to the advice and remonstrances of his friends and forsaken those ruinous indulgences which produced, or at least hastened his death, which took place July 21st, 1796. Remember, Matthew's a Quaker. His fate was that which usually awaits the intemperate. Burns was emphatically the poet of truth and of nature. It was a court bard, Cowley, who declared to Charles II that poets succeed best in fiction, and however true the assertion might be with regard to his own writings, it is disproved by those of Burns. His most beautiful poems were composed in the spirit of truth, and glow with the fire of real feeling and passion. Full of affectionate and sad remembrances, he composed the verses, quote, to Mary in heaven, commencing, My Mary dear, departed shade, where is thy blissful place of rest? Seest thou thy lover lowly laid? Hearest thou the groans that rend his breast? His breast? That's a question. In this he celebrates their last meeting. The Mary of Burns was a peasant girl, whose acquirements merely enabled her to read the Bible and psalm book, and who walked barefooted to their trysting place, and yet she inspired the most enthusiastic attachment in a man whose intellect cast a glory upon the hills and woods and streams of his native land, and a halo around the objects of his love, which will endure as long as the human breast is warmed with the glow of social and patriotic feeling. That is not Francis Durivage. Francis Durivage was a sociopath who ripped Matthew off, a cold guy. This is Mathew Franklin Whittier, the poet and philosopher, the brother of John Greenleaf Whittier. So that's where Matthew got his start ghostwriting for Francis Durivage. Some of this I put together and extrapolated, admittedly. Now, what do we have here? This is The Rag Picker, or Bound and Free. This is Matthew's novel social reform novel par excellence that he published anonymously in 1855. It was glowingly reviewed by William Lloyd Garrison, who said in his review that he read it at one sitting. We're talking 431 pages that he read in one sitting, he says. Here's the dedication to Matthew's sister, Elizabeth. Of course, it doesn't mention her by name, but that dedication is to Elizabeth Whittier. To my sister, excuse me, I didn't get water. The firm and unwavering friend of oppressed humanity and of the poor, the unfortunate, and the erring everywhere, this volume is affectionately dedicated by its author. This was published in October of 1855 in New York by the Mason brothers. There's no name in the copyright. It says, entered according to Act of Congress in the year 1855 by Mason brothers in the clerk's office of the District Court for the Southern District of New York. 2 months later, George Burnham, who had purchased a book-selling company called Fetterhen and Company, now he named it Burnham, Fetterhen and Company, and he advertised that book with his name as the author in, I think it was the Boston Herald. Then he got somebody on that paper, I think it was, to mention him as the author. And then somebody else, another editor in the True Flag, announced that the real author of The Rag Picker had been found, and it was George Burnham. And then I couldn't find anything else. That was Boston. It died. Burnham's attempt to associate his name with this book died. But then it got picked up by a biographer writing a biographical sketch of Burnham. It got picked up that he was the author. He must have found one of those newspapers or heard it somewhere, or Burnham told him that he was the author. And then that, I think, there might have been another step in like the early 1900s. And then a copy of this book ended up with an acquisitions librarian. And she looked it up and saw that Burnham was claimed as the author, and she penciled it in. Well, I've erased it. I erased Burnham's penciled in name in this one. It erased very nicely. I did it very gently. But then that copy she had was digitized, and it was sent to all the other libraries. And on her digitized copy, it says George P. Burnham. See? So everybody says that George Burnham is the author, and if you go to find a reprint of it, on the front cover it says George P. Burnham as the author. He never touched this thing. I think he was a racist. The last half of this is a very hard-hitting anti-slavery book, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that's what Garrison compared it to. It's very much like Matthew's first novel, The Debtor's Prison, except larger, but it basically reads like The Debtor's Prison. If I do nothing else, I would like to get George Burnham's name disassociated from that book. You've got crooks with their names on deeply moral and spiritual literature, like A Christmas Carol claimed by Charles Dickens. That's not the only instance. What do we got here? I know this is getting long, but I got a lot of stuff. Okay, this is The Life and Letters of John Greenleaf Whittier by Samuel Picard, who was Matthew's son-in-law and his longtime nemesis. Long story. I won't go into that. On page 32 is the etching of Mathew Franklin Whittier, and this is the first thing I ever saw of Matthew, not in this book, on a website. That was my first encounter with Mathew Franklin Whittier. And as soon as I looked into the eyes of that portrait, I knew I was looking at myself. So I have a copy of that. What is this huge tome here? This is Graham's Magazine, because at the end of Graham's Magazine is The Raven, which they published a year after it appeared in the Carpetbag. It appeared in the Carpetbag in December of 1852. This is December of 1853. And they did not say where they got it. So we have caught Graham stealing somebody else's work for his own publication. This is Punch. I won't open that up and go through that. That's Punch 1851. I believe there's one of Mathew's poems in here. I talked about that in my first book. I had an illustrator who actually illustrated for Punch in modern day do an illustration for me for the poem. I think he was John Tenniel, I think the guy's name is. I think he's the reincarnation of one of the men that used to draw for Punch back in the day. But can't prove it. He certainly looked like him. I actually wrote him asking for permission to mention that, and he didn't write back, so he wasn't on board with reincarnation. This is Douglas Jerrold's Illuminated magazine. There's at least one piece in here which I am quite sure Mathew wrote about the, here it is, A Night with the Industrious Fleas. The Industrious Fleas was a flea circus which came to America also, could have been seen in either Europe or America. This is Mathew's story, very much along the lines of Some Words with a Mummy. It's been pilfered by somebody who's signing as Piers Shafton, gentleman. Now, I don't know who Piers Shafton was, but if I'm correct about this, it does indicate that Mathew did, in fact, send some of his work overseas. I think that's 1844. I think Mathew sent work overseas to certain people, including Elizabeth Barrett, future Elizabeth Barrett Browning, in 1842, the same year that he would have shared the Raven with Poe. After Abby died, Mathew apparently went through a period of sending his work off to various literati. Unfortunately, they stole it. Some of them stole it. This is what I'm worried about with my work. You know, as I mentioned in one of my recent blog entries, they're not going to, you know, give you lauds and honors and oh, this is the Penny magazine, which I think Mathew and Abby probably read together, but there's no need to go into that. I'll get these in order here. This is the New England Magazine, published by Joseph T. Buckingham and his son Edwin. This is the first one, volume 1. It actually has a very, very faint inscription that you can barely even read by the editor himself. And Mathew has quite a number of pieces in here. None of them signed by himself, of course. The very first one, On the Consideration Due to the Mechanical Arts, the very first piece in the very first edition, that's Mathew Franklin Whittier. And there are others. There's one that I know Mathew wrote, which Joseph T. Buckingham claimed his son Edwin had written after Edwin died. Apparently Edwin died young. And I know it's Mathew's. I know it's Mathew's signature. So as I mentioned earlier, the way I put it together is Mathew must have submitted it anonymously or with a pseudonym. I think it's Phineas Pica, pretending to be the editor's printer. Well, Mathew had been the editor's printer many, many years ago, as his son Edwin had been. So I think Mathew assumed he would figure it out, but what happened is that he fondly imagined that his son had written it, and Mathew didn't have the heart to, you know, correct him about it, so he let him think that his son had written that piece. That's what I'm guessing. Now here is the next volume. This is 1832, volume 2. And there's two pieces in here by Mathew, actually, as I figured out. None of them are signed by Mathew. One of them is this one, and it comes immediately after Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes was also printed in Mathew's paper, the one that he was editing, the New York Constellation. This is called The Unsuccessful Author. It's signed XYZ. Mathew wrote that. He signed his XYZ later, as I've explained. Okay, let's go through these kind of quickly. What do we have here? This is about B.P. Shillabur. It's a biography. There's a whole lot of stuff wrong in there. And this is, I've got 4 copies of The Mistake of a Lifetime. Matthew published this in 1850. He signed with a pseudonym Waldo Howard. I know definitely it's his because he came out with one of his typical Joe Strickland style announcements about it, where he's protesting against the critics, saying he's the author. So I know it's Matthew. It's excellent. It's a tour de force, really magnificent, complicated, gripping, and the story behind it is that supposedly, according to one of the reviewers who made fun of it, this fledgling author with his first novel approached Frederick Gleason, who was the owner of Gleason's Pictorial and also the Flag of Our Union, in which Francis Durivage had been publishing from Matthew's portfolio for like a year or two. And so this author approached Frederick Gleason, and Gleason was so taken with this novel, he couldn't put it down. And he kept offering more and more money until he got up to $3,000, which was a huge amount of money back in 1850. So the deal was $3,000 plus royalties. Well, what actually happened is you have a brilliant, unknown author, Mathew Franklin Whittier, who'd been publishing since he was a boy of 12 in 1825 and knew what he was doing. It was no fledgling author at all, and he must have sent an agent. So Gleason never knew who actually wrote this book. It's good. I think I opened up one of my first blog entries reading from it. So I have 4 copies of that. And then there's various and sundry other little things, 1 or 2 more. This is another of the novels that Matthew Ghost wrote for Durivage back in 1845, roughly 46. It's called Edith Vernon, or Crime and Retribution. It's just a reprint, can't get an original of that. Here's another one, Mike Martin, or The Last of the Highwaymen, A Romance of Reality. That was not written by Francis Durivage, that was ghost written by Mathew Franklin Whittier. And here's another one, Angela, or Love and Guilt, A Tale of Boston and Its Environs. Says by F.A. Durivage. That's not Durivage, that's Matthew ghostwriting for Francis Durivage back in the mid-1840s. If you look at these novels, it's almost like Matthew's writing the same story, and it's almost like they're all a precursor for The Mistake of a Lifetime. The same names come in there, like Edith. You know, we have Edith Vernon here. Well, Edith shows up as one of the characters in Mistake of a Lifetime. And then last but not least, and this again is a reprint because this is like right off the Google pages, Yankee Doodle. This is volume 1 and 2. Yankee Doodle was a Huber magazine like Punch. It was also like the Carpetbag, but it was the first in America that used this humor format, like Cruikshank's Almanac and Punch. As far as I know, it was the first. Matthew has a very strong presence in this, including a parody of The Raven and a parody of Edgar Allan Poe. We have here on this page with a piece that was written by Matthew on the top, and underneath is a parody of The Raven, his first one, not The Vulture, which was his second one, but this was like, I think, 1847. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, lolling weary, over several curious books of sure-to-be-forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly sleeping, suddenly there came a creeping, as of some grimalkin peeping at an open pantry door. So I said, 'tis some mosquito, or some fly was here before, only this and nothing more. But full soon there came a burning that brought on uneasy turning, and again I felt the creeping somewhat stronger than before. Then I cried, there's in the blanket something worse, and I don't thank it for coming thus to prank it and my quiet couch explore. For coming thus at midnight hour my calm couch to explore, 'tis a most confounded bore. So my watch I straight did handle, and I lit another candle, when I saw a raven bedbug that had stepped up from the floor. Oh, the sight of such a monster would have made the gravest dawn stir. It was such a mighty bedbug as you never saw before. Such a monstrous, monstrous bedbug did I never see before. and I hope to see no more. So it goes on about the bed bug. So that's Mathew Franklin Whittier publishing in Yankee Doodle. That's it. That's my book library. I've got over here in this cabinet is a whole bunch of individual pieces, some of which I've shared. I've got 2 drawers worth of newspapers, which I won't go into now, obviously, because I don't know where we are in terms of time, but I know it's long. So we shall see. I had a little microphone problem. I set up my good microphone, separate microphone, and I had this really high-pitched hum. I couldn't get rid of it. Turned a little bit. I don't know. There's like dirty power here in this corner of the house or something. So I'm double recording with my cell phone and the one on the webcam. We'll see how that goes. But I hope you found this interesting. Of course, I can't go into any depth when I'm just running through this library like that. But the point is just to give some sense of the sheer extent of Mathew's literary legacy. And I haven't done everything by any means. This is the ones I have, physical copies of. There's a lot more that I haven't talked about in terms of the newspaper, because mostly he wrote for newspapers, So it's vast. And I think what I'm trying to show is that Mathew had the credentials to have written these pieces I claim for him. This is not just a nobody that I found somewhere, in the historical record and blew up into ridiculous proportions so that I could claim that he was the author of A Christmas Carol and the author of The Raven and the author of other things, It's just not what happened. You can think that, and it's a theory, but it's just not right. So if you have these theories that you assume are correct because they're convenient for you, if you're a logical human being and you claim the high ground of logic, you need to go back and examine that assumption because it just isn't right. What I stumbled onto is a literary genius with a long, august track record that is hidden because he hid himself, because he wrote almost all of this stuff anonymously, with the exception of that children's book. It's the only book I have that's signed by him is that children's book, The Tempter and the Tempted, Harry Lee, The Tempter and the Tempted. Everything else is with pseudonyms and anonymous. But that's what took me 12 years now of research, was to be sure that Mathew was the author of all these things. And that requires a huge, as I said, a tapestry. It requires connecting the dots and looking at the intersection of all of these different pieces and gradually building up an understanding of who he was, and also a searchable database of all of these pieces so that you can cross-reference. Like, for example, I can go in and find that Mathew used the word sublunary in that dictionary he ghost wrote for Francis Durbage. He used sublunary in his edition of The Raven. Poe took it out. And he used it a total of, I think it was 22 times in his legacy, the word sublunary. So because I have the database, I can go in and search for that and say, oh, that was definitely one of his favorite words. But you can do that with a whole host of Mathew's favorite terms. I can go in and see how many times he used some pumpkins and in what pieces. See, I can go in and look for where he signed with an asterisk, with a star. And the fact that I have pieces, reviews, that look very much like the ones he wrote for the New York Tribune that are claimed for Margaret Fuller. I have star-signed reviews before, and I also have star-signed reviews after her death that look exactly the same author, style-wise. So once I have this database and some of these physical copies, I can do quite a bit of research with it, even though I haven't been trained as a researcher. I pretty much figured out how to do it. So today you've gotten to see me with 8 hours sleep, a little better maybe. And I now have to put this together, see what the audio sounds like, and then I got to put my library back together so the books are in correct order. That'll take me a little while, so I've got something to do today. I hope you found some of this interesting. I hope you came away with an understanding, or a better understanding, of Mathew Franklin Whittier's literary legacy, how good it is, how extensive it is, and how varied it is. I didn't get a chance to really delve into too many of these things. I would love to sit down and read from each one of them, but obviously it'd be too long. So once again, thank you for watching.